George Armstrong Custer, like many high-ranking military officers of the day, surrounded himself with a devoted circle of relatives and friends. By 1876, the officers of the 7th Cavalry were split into pro- and anti-Custer factions. The hard feelings among the officers were further intensified by Custer's having managed to secure the assignment of his younger brother Tom Custer and his brother-in-law James Calhoun to his regiment. 5 immediate or extended members of the Custer family took part in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On June 25, 1876, the day of battle, the 7th Cavalry's senior officer, Colonel Samuel Sturgis, was on detached duty in St. Louis. Troops in the field were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, 36, one of the most celebrated Indian fighters of the time. Captain Tom Custer, 31, rode with the 5 companies led personally by George Custer. Tom Custer had distinguished himself during the Civil War, receiving the Medal of Honor twice for bravery, becoming the first of only 16 individuals in American history to achieve this distinction. After the Civil War, Tom Custer was appointed a first lieutenant in the 7th Cavalry. He was wounded at the Battle of the Washita and took part in the Black Hills Expedition of 1874. During the 1876 campaign, he served as aide-de-camp to his older brother, Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, and died with his brother on Last Stand Hill. In an interview given in 1900, Dr. Henry Porter recounted, "As soon as we could, several of the officers and myself went over to where Custer had fought. We found Custer's body stark naked, as white and clean as a baby's. He was shot in the head and breast. The body of Captain Tom Custer, General Custer's brother, was horribly mutilated. He was disemboweled and his head had been crushed in by a blow from a stone hammer used by the Indians. The only arrow wound I found was in his head. He had the Sioux mark of death, which was a cut from the hip to the knee, reaching to the bone. His heart was not cut out, as has been reported." In fact, Tom Custer's body had been so badly mutilated that his remains were identified only by a recognizable tattoo of his initials on his arm. The bodies of George and Tom Custer were wrapped in canvas and blankets and then buried on the field in a shallow grave. When soldiers returned a year later, the brothers' grave had been scavenged by animals and the bones scattered. According to a witness, not more than a double handful of small bones were picked up. George Custer was reinterred with full military honors at West Point Cemetery on October the 10th, 1877. The remains of Tom Custer were reinterred at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And then there was Boston Custer, 27, the youngest brother. Boston was unable to officially join the Army due to poor health, even though brother George had tried to secure a lieutenant's commission for him. Boston Custer became a civilian contractor, serving as forage master for the 7th Cavalry during the 1874 Black Hills Expedition, and serving as a forager and packer for the regiment during the 1876 campaign. With Boston Custer and the pack train was the Custer's brother's nephew, Henry Armstrong Oddie Reed, 18. Reed idolized his soldier uncles and signed up as a civilian beef herder for the regiment on May the 10th. Hearing from a messenger that Lieutenant Colonel Custer had requested ammunition for an impending fight, Boston Custer and Audie Reed left the pack train and headed for Custer's main column as it moved into position to attack. According to the regiment's orderly, John Merton, he urged Reed to stay back with the pack train where he belonged, but Reed taunted him, saying, "You're mad because you can't go along," before riding off for combat. Both Reed and Boston Custer were killed on Last Stand Hill. Originally buried on the battlefield, the remains of Audie Reed and Boston Custer, after a bit of string pulling by family and friends, were exhumed, the only exceptions to the rule that only commissioned officers would be shipped home for burial. They were reinterred on January the 8th, 1878 at Woodland Cemetery in Monroe, Michigan. What about James Calhoun? On the day of battle, George Custer was driven back from an unsuccessful attempt to cross the river to successive stands on higher ground. 3/4 of a mile from the river, Company L, commanded by Lieutenant James Calhoun, the brother-in-law of the Custer brothers, was thrown across the line of retreat. It was here, on what is now known as Calhoun Hill, during a fierce fight, that Maggie Custer's husband, Jimmy, known as the Adonis of the Seventh, died as the Indians drove the fleeing cavalrymen toward Last Stand Hill. Calhoun's remains would later be reinterred at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In early July 1876, George Custer's widow, Libby, received a letter from Monroe, Michigan, describing Father Custer as being in tears most of the time, and Mother Custer, already frail and in poor health, repeatedly crying, "How can I bear it? All my boys gone." There was, however, one remaining brother, Nevin, too sickly for the military, who passed on the Custer name.